Okay, welcome everyone to this virtual North American Kant Society meeting and the Symposium on Kant and the Systematicity of the Sciences, a book edited by Gabriele Gava and Thomas Sturm and Achim Vesper, which has come out with Routledge. So we're very excited to have a symposium on this book. I'm Robert Cluis, Vice President of the North American Kant Society, and I would like to welcome you all to this. I would like to say just a few words about the book, and this is from material about the book. And this book provides the first comprehensive discussion regarding the role that Kant ascribes to systematicity in the sciences. It considers not only what Kant has to say on systematicity in general, but also how the systematicity requirement for science is specified in different fields of knowledge. So the chapters are divided into three thematic sections. Part one is devoted to historical context. And then the chapters there explore precursors of Kant's account of the systematicity of the sciences. Part two addresses the application of systematicity to the special sciences, so cosmology, physics, chemistry, logic, mathematics, the life sciences, and history. And then finally, part three explores the systematicity of philosophy. The book will be of interest to scholars and advanced students working on Kant and the history and philosophy of science. So we're very excited to have Michela Massimi and Paul Hoyningen-Huene speak about this. Before I turn it over to Thomas and our commentators and everyone, I just want to read maybe a list of some of the contributors, from a list of the contributors from the table of contents. And I see many of you are in the room, the Zoom room, so that's great to see you all here. So we have Gabriele Gava, Henry Bloma, and together Fabian Burt and Thomas Sturm, Clinton Tolley, Catherine Dunlop, Thomas Sturm, Hein Vanderberg, Bennett McNulty, Stephen Howard, Andre Hamann, Waping Lu Adler, Eric Watkins, Stefano Bachin, and Paul Geyer. And from the introduction, which I did read, I'd just like to read this quote, which stuck out to me. The picture that emerges here of Kant as a philosopher of science is richer than interpretations with an exclusive focus on his views concerning the a priori presuppositions of science have it. There may be still other aspects of scientific systematicity in Kant, and surely the ones we have expressed in these claims they put forward in the introduction might be formulated differently. We have aimed to show both central similarities of Kant's applications of the basic concepts, that is, of systematicity, and its many case-sensitive and flexible adaptations. So the format will be just to turn it over to Thomas briefly, and then to Paul, and then to Michela, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A, okay? So with that, then I'll turn it over to Thomas. Thank you very much and welcome again.
Wonderful. Everybody see my slides?
So we see also your comments. So yeah, now it's better. Yeah.
So thanks everybody for coming. I'm very pleased and I'm also very grateful to the North American Kant Society for hosting this event, and I'm very happy to see so many familiar faces. At the moment, not so many because I'm looking at my slides, but so many familiar faces, old and then also some new faces. I'm hoping that the book will be inspiring for a new generation of Kant scholars who are working here, but also I hope in the end, and this is a hope that we co-editors all share, that the book will have an impact beyond pure Kant scholarship. And my task today is to give those who have not yet had the time to read the book or have no access to it yet, to give a brief précis before our two commentators will be introducing the discussion. And I will need 5 to 10 minutes. So why do we need this book? Why this book right now? The book is framed by the general philosophical interest in the two questions which are fundamental in philosophy of science or have been fundamental in philosophy of science over the last century. The first, the definitional question, what is science? And then the second question, what is scientific progress, or sometimes stated differently, how does scientific knowledge differ positively and progressively from other kinds of knowledge? And when you have had your introduction to philosophy of science 101 and gone through the different systems in the philosophy of science, you will see that these questions and similar ones have never received an agreed upon answer. The theories that have been developed over the last century, since broadly speaking, logical empiricism and neo-Kantianism, have developed more fine-grained views, but there is no consensus about how to answer them. And as some people, for instance, philosopher of science Philip Kitcher has pointed out, in the last 2 decades, 3 decades or so, these general questions have left the center of philosophy of science. And philosophy of science, as it's practiced nowadays, is mostly philosophy of the special sciences and philosophy of the relation between science and society, or science and human values. Those are the current hot topics, so to speak. But there is a wonderful exception, and this is the book by Paul Hoyningen-Huene, Systematicity, the Nature of Science, published a couple of years ago. And there is a kind of relation between our project and Paul. Paul will point that out in his presentation. So this is the broader philosophical background for this book, and connecting to Kant, the passage that Robert read from the introduction is right in place. Kant's philosophy of science over the last half century, broadly since the 1960s, has been dominated by discussions over the necessity and the role of a priori knowledge in science. Kant is mostly known as the philosopher of science who has established the idea that synthetic a priori knowledge is necessary even in the most rigid of all sciences and mathematics, in natural science. That has been a common thread of scholarship from neo-Kantianism to Michael Friedman's relative a priori, to emphasize and focus only on this point, which we do not deny in the book. Of course, that would be absurd, but we embed it in a broader view. And therefore, our main goals with this book are to correct and complement the record of what Kant's philosophy of science really is, if one considers all of its components, and thereby hopefully to revive the debate over the 2 basic questions of philosophy of science: what is science and what is scientific progress, by means of an in-depth case study in the history of philosophy concerning our favorite philosopher from Königsberg. And as Robert has already outlined, the book has 3 main sections, which I post here for you, and especially those who haven't had access to the book here. We give first a selection from the historical backgrounds. Kant did not invent his account of scientific systematicity out of nothing. He had certain precursors, out of which this book discusses 2 in closer detail, namely Crusius, which is discussed by my co-editor Gabriele Gavà. He had a theory of the ends of human knowledge, and this is compared with Kant's view. And then Johann Heinrich Lambert, the famous philosopher-scientist who developed many terms that were important for Kant, even though Kant always gave them their own twist and turn. And this is discussed by Henny Blom's chapter, which focuses on how Lambert conceived of the idea and developed the idea that not only is each science for itself systematic, that's a view that he shares with Kant, but also there has to be a system of the sciences, and the systems that Lambert and Kant developed respectively differ very much. So this is a kind of case study concerning the historical background from which Kant started, or that he was faced with. The book, of course, could not cover everything. There could be studies that compare Wolff and Kant. Actually, there have been such studies by Norbert Hinske, for instance, or more recently by Hein van den Berg. I recently, partly inspired by remarks that Paul Hoyningen-Huene made already at the conference from which this book stems, namely that D'Alembert made a very interesting distinction between the esprit des systèmes, so the spirit of the systems, and the esprit systématique, the systematic spirit by which scientific research has to be pursued. And I think it would be indeed useful to compare at some point Kant's views about scientific systematicity with d'Alembert, Kant had the Discours préliminaire, if in a German version, on his bookshelves. The second part of the book concerns the systematicity of the special sciences, all of the sciences that Kant at some point engaged with, studied, discussed, and even contributed to. So cosmology, logic, mathematics, physics, life sciences, history, and physical anthropology are being discussed in case studies. Others, again, could have been discussed within this book. Partly that has happened in previous literature, partly that needs to be done yet in the future, and we hope to provide, therefore, an idea of how this is to be done. And then finally, in the third part, we turn to certain aspects of Kant's own meta-philosophy, so to speak, because for Kant, philosophy is also a candidate of a potential science, even though it's constantly in trouble, as we all know. And Kant discusses and applies the concept of systematicity to philosophy itself. But in philosophy, there is also a curious circularity there, because philosophy at the same time provides, Kant says, a foundation for all of the special sciences through transcendental philosophy and metaphysics, as we know. And there are different aspects to be discussed here. In the book, we turn to Kant's famous distinction between logical versus real systematicity. This is discussed by Watkins, but also by contributions other in the book. For instance, in Clinton Tolley's chapter on logic, this comes up, or in Paul Geyer's chapter called Kant, Philosophy, Science, the Systems of Systems. And then also the question, of course, whether and in how far Kant's ethical theory is systematic, which is discussed by Stefano Baccini. And then again, there could be other topics that could be added to this. For instance, how does Kant think about the function of science for human progress, which a point that he makes in various passages. He thinks science is not only there for itself, but it also is an essential motor for human progress, one of the outstanding achievements that enables us to practice rational discourse in society about certain important questions, and that is something that humans can learn and make progress there. But how is that related to his idea that science is systematic? No? Okay, so that's the structure of our book. And I will just summarize what we have in the introduction as well in 9 main points. I shall not call them theses because they are not properly, sometimes they are not properly theses, but just elements of this complex notion of systematicity that Kant has. And the first 3 concern basically Kant's picture of science in general, as opposed to the special sciences. For him, it is clear that systematicity is the central hallmark of science. There is some justifiable discussion over whether it is more central than the notion of a priority of certain areas of scientific knowledge. But Kant sometimes says, indeed, that there is no science which is not systematic or does not at least aim to become systematic and provide a certain kind of framework for that. An important message that Kant tries to convey here is that systematicity distinguishes sciences qua systematized knowledge from common knowledge and also from mere aggregates of knowledge, doctrines that have not yet been subsumed under, as he would call it, an idea of reason. The second important point, and this is where we locate the classical studies of Kant's philosophy of science in scholarship. Now, for this systematization of knowledge, certain concepts and principles of the understanding, as well as ideas and schemata of reason, are required. Kant says, for instance, that no one brings science about without having an idea of it, even if it is only a preliminary idea that needs to be refined in the course of further research. But these concepts and principles and ideas, they function in certain ways for the development. They provide frameworks for the special sciences and thereby make possible steady progress in science, which brings us to the third point, the scientific progress point. The systematization of knowledge aims at ever more unified and more comprehensive scientific systems of knowledge or theories or doctrines. Kant uses different terms here. And what is important here is that for Kant, scientific knowledge is not, and its systematicity is not only a product notion, but it's also a process notion. The systematization of knowledge through the sciences requires that we view progress in science as a historical and dynamic process, and that we need to understand also how scientists are enabled to make progress against certain hindrances or stumbling blocks that we find in the history of human cultural development. The next 4 points all concern more or less the notion of systematicity as applied to specific sciences. The systematization of different sciences can indeed follow different types of principles, although there are sometimes familiarities, and certain papers in our volume, especially in part 2, make clear what kind of framing concepts and principles and ideas of reason Kant applies within specific scientific domains, and how these make these the different sciences that they are. So while there is a certain unity of science as a certain kind of cognitive enterprise in human history, there is for Kant an essential plurality of the sciences, a lasting differentiation of the scientific enterprise that is partly, as I emphasize, based in the different concepts and principles, ideas of reason. Sorry. At the same time, we need to understand how all the different sciences, just as in each particular science, we need to understand how the different cognitions are unified through ideas of reason and through the concepts and principles of the understanding. We also need to understand how all the different sciences hang together and stand in friendly or complementary or supportive relations. The sciences must ideally be classified within a complete system of all sciences. And that's, of course, a widespread 18th century endeavor to understand that, and an endeavor that has met with many obstacles, as famously represented in the difficulties of the French encyclopedia, for instance. And the differences that you see, for instance, between Lambert's classification of the sciences and Kant's own and others. Kant himself thinks that special sciences are defined, that's the 6th point, through definitions that contain for each sciences a characterization in terms of its object or subject matter, its method or methods. Sometimes there is a plurality of methods in the sciences. And then finally, what is important but sometimes downplayed, that each science also is characterized by specific goals or ends that it has. These may be theoretical or practical goals. And I have already mentioned that Gabriele Gavas' first chapter on Crusius's system of ends anticipates some of Kant's ideas, but of course, as always, Kant is a self-thinker who does not leave things as they are normally. And then finally, the 7th point, the ends of the sciences, they must be reflected and organized systematically in this hierarchical manner. And by this hierarchy of ends of the sciences, they can also contribute perhaps to the ultimate goal of serving the essential humans of humankind, more broadly speaking. This is a rather loose connection, but it is asserted by Kant. It is an interesting question to think about how he views these as systematically connected, actually. The final 2 points that we sort of see as connecting themes of our contributions are metaphilosophical in nature, as one could say. Philosophy as a discipline is a discipline that itself aspires to be systematic in all of its parts. And this is exemplified especially by the contributions by Stefano Bachin and Paul Geyer, and to become thereby a science. Everyone knows that Kant thinks that philosophy as he finds it in his time is in severe problems, and that it needs to be reformed, if not revolutionized. And then finally, this is a slightly different point. Philosophy has special roles vis-a-vis the special science, and it helps them towards their own specific ways of systematization of cognition through a whole battery of higher order considerations. For instance, by providing the a priori frameworks or the special sciences, by moving from the mere logical to the real uses of reason for the reconstruction of the connection of knowledge claims and their proper objects, or by understanding both the connections between our representations and the connections between the objects of such representations, or by reflecting the goals and ends of research and their hierarchies, as we've seen, and by reflecting and improving also the methods and tools of research. Kant has not the idea that there is one unique method for the sciences, but each science has to develop its own method and instruments. And he sometimes even says, this is something that has also not been noted very often in the literature, that what kind of organon, as he calls it, a science develops is something that one can have stated only after a lot of research has been done and a lot of knowledge about the subject matter or the domain of objects of a particular scientific field has already been achieved. So method, in a sense, comes second after we have already some knowledge. There is a set of questions that would follow this point, but Kant is clear, makes this point sometimes. And of course, he helps, philosophy is supposed to help the sciences to redefine themselves over the course of their historical development better. This is perhaps most vivid in the kinds of sciences that Kant considers to be not yet fully developed sciences or only potential sciences, such as his own anthropology, but also physical geography, history, and many chemistry, perhaps biology, the life sciences, and other fields beyond that. So those are the 9 points that connect the theme, that also show how complex Kant's notion of systematicity is, that it is far more than just about the mere logical reconstruction of the connection of knowledge claims within the sciences or anything else. And yeah, a point that I just added for reflection here. What does that mean? How does that match with Kant's own meta-philosophy? Because, of course, when Kant makes these claims, we must be clear what the status of the emerging account is that could be reconstructed from that. It is famously known that Kant claims that philosophy does not begin from definitions, though they might be achieved at the end of longer inquiries. And I think that when he speaks about the definition of science in general and of special sciences in particular, this is an example for that. He says at certain points that one can give preliminary definitions of special sciences, but these need to be refined over the course of longer inquiries. That is, philosophy helps the scientist to redefine itself. And if you read, for instance, logic lectures or anthropology lectures, you sometimes find him reflecting on how our understanding of historical research or mathematics has been become more self-aware and more reflective over the course of centuries. So it follows, I think, and I hope to be provoking Paul a little bit here, that the Kantian account of systematicity is neither the result of mere conceptual or armchair analysis, nor of empirical investigations into science as historians or sociologists of science would do nowadays. Instead, I think what he's doing is he's taking all these reflections about special cases and the more general reflections about the nature and the progressivity of science, and develops a conceptual explication of the notion of systematicity, in the sense of he does not simply take the notion of systematicity as it exists, but he refines it in certain respects for a specific agenda that he has, for the task of making us think better about very important philosophical questions, such as what is science, what makes scientific progress possible, how is scientific progress possible if we divide up scientific labor into disciplines or a whole architectonic of all sciences. And then finally, the broader question, what is the function and the possibility of science to promote human progress overall? And that's all I had to say. Thank you very much. So I stopped sharing this. so that Paul can take over from here.
Yes, thank you very much. Now we will hear from Paul Hoyningen-Huene.
You don't see my screen, do you?
We do.
You do?
You do.
Yes.
Okay. So I even open it and then it should be perfect. Is it okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I can start?
But we see your view. I mean, not just also the next slide. So the presenter view.
Okay. Okay.
Don't know how you can fix it.
I don't know how to fix that. Now you see the normal thing and
Yes.
okay.
If you move your cursor down, Paul, there is on the bottom of your, yes, go closer to the bottom of your page. There you see 4 icons. Yes, the next one to the right.
This one?
This one. Click this one.
Yeah, this I had used. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm aware of that.
Good. You're good to go.
It's good now? Okay. Whatever. All right. Thank you very much for inviting me. Systematicity today and Kant is my topic. Systematicity today. What's the systematicity of the sciences today? My answers is in this book that Thomas mentioned already. I'm not going into much detail of my book, but I'm giving you some sort of, well, heavily autobiographic sort of way towards Kant, and it's possibly a little too autobiographic, but that may be the result of the onset of senility, which is quite age adequate. But anyway, you'll get over it. Okay, that appeared at Oxford. When I started this work in the 1980s, I did not connect it with Kant at all because I didn't see that. This was simply not simply due to ignorance, but there was a systematic reason that I discovered only later and a longer history. Now, in 1979, I was asked by geographers to give a talk about the nature of geography as a science. And for this aim, I had to say something about what science is and then connect it to geography. Got the literature from the geographers. And then I thought, what is science? How should I characterize it? And my answer was then, I still remember when I came up with that, yeah, science is systematic knowledge, seemed to be very natural, and which you also find, by the way, in lots of literature, that people just as side remarks, as if it was taken absolutely for granted, science is systematic. You find it everywhere. You find many locations in my book on that. And then I explained that systematic has here 3 meanings. That was, as I said, 79. It means that scientific knowledge claims have to be defended in a rule-based way. That was my status in 79. I would put that differently now. It's just defense of knowledge claims that has to be systematic. Then scientific knowledge is structured according to its subject matter. That's another important point. And third, science has an ideal of completeness. And this is the 3 things how I explained what science is, and that was good enough then to apply to the geographical literature I had read. And perhaps I should start noting that here the noun system never occurs in my paper, only the adjective systematic, and I'll make more of that a little later. Okay. I only realized that much later, however. And then for some 15 years, I did not work on systematicity at all. And I started again in the mid-1990s. And I developed the systematicity idea into the following main thesis, which is now in my book. Systematic scientific knowledge differs from other kinds of knowledge, in particular from everyday knowledge, primarily by being more systematic. And there you see there is, first of all, the contrast to everyday knowledge, which is, of course, then a turn away from Popper's way of characterizing science by his demarcation criteria and demarcating it from metaphysics and pseudoscience. And I said that didn't lead anywhere, so I make a distinction and a contrast to everyday knowledge. And there is a comparative more systematic. This was something I saw. I didn't see it 79, but I saw it then, that one has to say science is more systematic than other forms of knowledge. And I'll come back to that as well. So in addition, this thesis was then developed into 9 sub-theses concerning different dimensions of science. I call them dimensions, aspects of science, like descriptions, explanations, etc. So what I'm claiming really is that scientific explanations are more systematic than everyday explanations. Scientific descriptions are more systematic. So I have to defend 9 sub-theses, and that for every scientific field, which is a lot of work. And then I discovered that in the 20th century, only one other author dealt extensively with systematicity. That was Nicholas Rescher from Pittsburgh. For instance, in his book, Cognitive Systematization, a systems theoretic approach to a coherentist theory of knowledge from 1979. I only discovered that in the course of my book then. And he had also written a paper on Kant that influenced me quite a bit, Kant on cognitive systematization from 83, and that influenced me in my view how Kant, what Kant's stance is towards systematicity, and I'll come back to that later. All right. However, I had difficulties to relate Rescher's work to mine, which I did, and this fact I did not really understand. I mean, I read Rescher's stuff, I thought I understood it, but it was very difficult for me to relate it to my work. So Rescher spoke about systematicity, I spoke about systematicity, but I had difficulties to create a contact. And that reminded me of incommensurability. You know, I had studied that in Kuhn and in Feyerabend, so I thought that there is some sort of incommensurability and I've got to find out what its roots are. And then I discovered that Rescher derived his term systematicity from the known system, whereas I derived my term systematicity from the adjective systematic. And I had done that without any thought, without reflection in my earlier paper in 79. I just used systematic and never used system. And it was quite natural to me and until I realized then that the noun systematicity may relate either strong to system or it may relate to systematic, and that is not the same. And then I saw that's the core why Rescher is speaking about things that are hard to bring in contact with my stuff, because he thinks when he talks about systematicity about system, and I think when I talk about systematicity about systematic. And clearly the relation is this: my systematicity was wider than his. A system is systematic, but not everything systematic belongs to a system. Other principles of order may generate its systematicity. So I've got a wider concept than the system concept when I talk about systematicity. As I said, I only realized it later. And even later, I discovered that this difference had been seen much earlier, even earlier than Kant's critical philosophy. And Thomas mentioned it already, that in 1751, French mathematician and encyclopedist d'Alembert distinguished between an esprit systématique and an esprit de système, and the former belonging to science, the latter to philosophy. Of course, in his time, when philosophy was really system building, as we know, Lambert, etc., etc. So this was quite plausible, and of course, it fitted then into my thought perfectly well. But d'Alembert was already 250 years almost earlier. Yeah, this is philosophy. So I saw that philosophy, systematicity as derived from system, is a special case of systematicity as derived from systematic. That's the bottom line here. Systematicity derived from system was pertinent, of course, for axiomatic systems like Euclidean geometry. There, of course, the noun-derived systematicity applies. And with this in mind, I approached Kant. So now to Kant. So my book, Systematicity, contains a chapter comparison with other positions that aims to show that earlier attempts to explicate the nature of science are special cases of systematicity theory. And because I'm talking here to historians or philosophers, I can unashamedly say this is, of course, basically the same idea as Hegel's in the phenomenology of spirit, where he says, I am just going through the different systems, philosophical systems, and each one is, in a sense, more general. I mean, in the sense of Aufheben, so quite complicated, but the basic idea is the same. So I'm not just saying that the older attempts about what the answers, what science is, are just, false, but they are one-sided and they are all aufgehoben, integrated in my most general theory about systematicity. And Aristotle is a case in point, of course. His Euclidean axiomatic ideal of science, at least this is what he writes in the meta-scientific stuff, not in what he's doing otherwise. I'm sorry, I got to get the camera, I think. I'm moving too rapidly. Oh, shit.
It's on. It seems to have just moved.
Yeah, I get the camera, don't worry.
Okay.
It's somewhere. Now we are back in the Danish format, right? That the camera is moving. All right. Back again. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Yes. Sorry. So this is a case in point that the Aristotelian form of characterization, what science is, he says, of course, it's got to be in the form of an axiomatic system. That's the Euclidean, ideal, which is roughly the same time that they originated. And similar, Kant seemed to be seemed to have the same point of view. To be real science, it had to be axiomatized, as I remembered from the Metaphysische Anfangsgründe. A discipline is only as much a proper science as is mathematics contained in it. And this is how I then started my chapter on Kant. Resch's paper, Kant on Cognitive Systematization, reassured me, because that's also Resch's point of view. And he says, for instance, the concept of system is perhaps the most central idea of Kant's theory of knowledge, for he saw systematization as the key commitment of pure human reason. Without his recourse to system, the critique of pure reason would be like Hamlet without the prince. And there, of course, you see immediately that systematization here, how Rescher uses it, is tied to system and, of course, not to systematic. And that is the same in Kant, he says. And that was, from my pre-knowledge about Kant, was compatible. So I wrote a section on Kant stating that Kant is like Euclid, a special case of my systematicity theory, because he supports systematicity in the sense of an axiomatic system. And this seems to be still, at least among the non-specialists, the majority opinion. However, when I write about things in which I'm not a specialist, I try to consult with the experts. And after an earlier discussion in 2007 and 2008, I sent a draft of my Kuhn section in June 2011 to Thomas Storm, whom I had known since his student days, which is now something like 420 years or something. I don't remember exactly, a long time ago.
In the Kant section, not the Kuhn section.
In the Kant section, in the Kuhn. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, misprint. Thank you. I sent, yeah, well, Kuhn is also always present. Okay. And he then gave me detailed critical comments that showed me that I had underestimated the complexity of Kant's thought regarding systematicity, and I had to change the section accordingly. The book we discussed today presents this complexity well. It also shows that the spirit of Kant and the spirit of a contemporary enterprise that seeks to understand science in its generality in terms of systematicity are very similar. And I discovered that, and this was nice, of course. Now I have two critical remarks. My first critical remark is very specific, and it concerns the 9 points that Thomas already showed us, that in the summary of the main aspects of Kant's accounts of systematicity on page 12 of the book, a list of 9 items, and I am missing 2 things there in this summary, although, of course, Thomas is at least aware of that. The first is that I mentioned already the distinction between systematicity as derived from the noun system and as derived from the adjective systematic. The first variant seems to be the only one that is considered in these 9 points. And connected to this lacuna, the importance of the comparative form of systematicity, that is the possibility of something being more or less systematic, is underdeveloped. It appears only indirectly in number 3 and number 9 and is never spelled out explicitly. And that, I think, is really a deficiency. Why? Because this has two unfavorable consequences. The first is that contrasting science with everyday knowledge suggests that everyday knowledge is completely unsystematic, which is wrong. If you don't have the comparative notion of systematicity, then you say, aha, scientific knowledge is systematic, everyday knowledge is not, and this is just wrong, because also everyday knowledge and other forms of knowledge have some sort of systematicity, and usually it's the case that scientific knowledge is just more systematic. And the second thing is that he may promote the widespread prejudice that for Kant, the only relevant kind of systematicity is the one that is derived from the noun system. And as we've learned, I learned at least, and some other people have to learn it still, that this is just also not correct, because Kant's position is much more differentiated here. And of course, the most convincing counterexample against the system's exclusive view of Kant, the most convincing counterexample is the systematicity display for Kant in the historical doctrines of nature, and there especially in the second part of it, in the natural history, as a systematic presentation of natural things at various times and places, in the metaphysical foundation of natural science. And there, you know, the first part there is, of course, classification, which you may describe as a system. But in the second part, namely natural history, it's not a classification. It's the orderly, you know, the orderly narrative. And that's, of course, not the form of a system, but it is systematic. So I think this is very important to see that, and it opened my eyes, at least also in my discussions with Thomas, that the system view of systematicity is too narrow, also for Kant. And clearly there is no system involved here. Second critical remark is a more general complaint, and I've got an ideal audience here to address them, although probably not the most, not the most ideal one, but in a sense it is, and you'll see immediately. Now, in my work in the general philosophy of science over more than 4 decades, I was twice unintentionally pushed towards Kant. And I must say, I wasn't really pleased about it. The reason being that I've got a German passport, and what I've seen so often that the French, they push Descartes, and the British push Hume and Locke, and the Germans push Kant and Hegel. And then you say, wait a minute, so your passport is more important than the quality of the respective philosophers. So I say, no, wait a minute, I don't want to do that. So I'm open-minded, whatever nationality some philosophers is, that shouldn't play a role. Anyway, I was unintentionally pushed towards Kant, but I couldn't help it. So in my work on Kuhn, I was forced to introduce a distinction between phenomenal world and a world in itself, which is, of course, quite familiar. In a sense, it's just slightly different words that I'm using here. And a very similar distinction in Kant is, of course, as far as I can see, one of the most important sources of philosophical tension within Kant's critical philosophy. And it is this tension, as far as I see, I'm not a historian or philosopher, that triggered the subsequent development towards so-called German idealism. It's one of the most important inner tensions or contradictions in the Kantian, well, system one can't really say, but in the Kantian building of philosophy. And I would have been it would have been immensely helpful for me if Kant scholars, so scholars of German idealism, had joined my contemporary systematic discussion, whether constructively or critically, about this relationship between, well, what I called then phenomenal world and world in itself, because the problems that Kant encountered, and for instance, as Jacobi put them, and many other people, of course, everyone discussed that at the time, they re-emerge in this discussion on Kuhn, and it would be helpful if someone, had joined this discussion. It never happened since '93, so I gave up. All right. Now, regarding my work on systematicity, only 2 historians of philosophy became interested. One is the already mentioned Thomas Sturm from Barcelona and Oliver Scholz from Münster. Their contributions were extremely helpful for me, but this was it, nothing more. Now, the impression I gained over the years is that many historians of philosophy turn into absolute historians in the sense that they cease to be interested in whether the doctrines they reconstruct are true or not. They just give up the question whether these doctrines are true. And I mean, in philosophy, in systematic philosophy, that should be the main aim of doing philosophy, finding out something true, if possible or not. And now I'm saying that, well, very clearly, they turn into scribes only interested in the elements of a particular philosophical system and their internal relations, or the relations between different historical systems. Say you discuss then, or they discuss then Kant and Fichte, and as was the relation between them. But it's completely internalist. And I give you two examples, which I still, when I wrote them down today again, I could only shake my head, but it's really the truth. It happened to me twice that I asked historians of philosophy after their talks whether they considered the doctrines they presented to be true or not. And now they did not understand the question. They did simply not understand the question. So one was a talk about Leibniz. Then I asked the speaker, do you think that Leibniz metaphysics is true? He did not understand the question. And it happened twice to me. I mean, I would immediately accept if someone says, yeah, I don't want to discuss this question, blah, 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 whatever. But not understanding the question seems to me, well, very strange to say the least. Both were German speaking, and of course, the Bacillus hermeneuticus, as it was sometimes called, is of course stronger, perhaps in the English-speaking history of science, history of philosophy section. This is not as extreme, but sometimes it's as extreme, and I think I'm quite unhappy about that, because then for me, then these people are less interesting to talk to. Although I can fully understand that historians of philosophy have no real interest in talking to those analytic philosophers who are just logic crunchers, or to people like Quine who believe that philosophy is as independent of the history of philosophy as physics is from the history of physics. Of course, it's not fun to talk to them, of course, and because they don't understand it. I mean, the same, I'm really aware of the same problem with philosophers of science and historians of science, and I can fully understand why many historians of science don't want to talk to the philosophers of science, because it's useless for them. They don't learn anything. They just hear lots of things they're not interested in. However, there are also other kinds of systematic philosophers, and I would like historians of philosophy to actively approach them and participate in their debates, to which they can make profound and very welcome contributions. This is the literature, and thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much for that presentation.
So I should unshare, right?
Yes. Now we'll turn it over to Michela Massimi.
Thank you very much. And in the interest of time, as I'm conscious that we're already approaching 5 p.m., I'll be brief, so I don't have any slides. So I'm just going to read out my commentary, and hopefully we can open for discussion. So I want to thank very much Thomas Sturm for this invitation, and it's a really great pleasure to be here for this panel discussion on this excellent book on Kant and the systematicity of the sciences. I'm really, really pleased to see so many good old colleagues and friends in the audience. And I see my role today really as opening up discussions, since we have the editors, we have several authors of the contributing chapters. And so in this spirit, I'm just going to raise 3 main questions that I hope we can pick up in the panel discussion. And I'm also going to make 2 very brief comments about the importance, historical importance, and the philosophical legacy of the idea of systematicity in Kant. So my 3 questions are, the first one is, what is systematicity? My second question is, why is scientific knowledge meant to display the property of systematicity for Kant? And my third question is, Why does systematicity matter not just for Kant, but for the history of science and for contemporary philosophy of science? So those are my three questions. I'm going to say something very briefly about them and then make two comments, and then we can open up for discussion. Briefly on my first question, what is systematicity? I think the essays in this book give us a really interesting array of possible answers to these questions. As I read some of those answers, some authors, thinking of the chapter by Barth and Thomas Turm, tease out the notion of systematicity through what I would call a perspectival strategy of resorting to a plurality of imaginary standpoints. Other authors, like Eric Watkins, drew attention to the double nature of systematicity, both as a logical and a real systematicity. And yet other authors like Stefano Bacin and Paul Geyer focus their attention on the moral dimension of Kant's philosophy and how systematicity is not just a property that can be predicated of the sciences, but systematicity refers also to a system of ends. So maybe I would like to invite the editors and the authors to discuss how they see systematicity to extend and branch out as an idea of reason in its hypothetical use, well beyond the realm of the understanding cognition and encompass not just the sciences, but also philosophy and moral philosophy. So that's my first very, very broad question. Coming to my second question, what is it about scientific knowledge that makes it display the property of being systematic, and not just mathematical physics, but also other sciences, as this volume persuasively shows? I think it's interesting that in the Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science, when Kant draws the distinction between properly or improperly so-called natural science, and relegates chemistry to the latter, even in the case of improperly called natural sciences like chemistry, Kant uses the adjective systematic. So maybe this latches on to what Paul was saying just before about the difference in more or less systematic. So even fields like chemistry that for Kant count as an art, rather than a proper science, we find that this adjective of being a systematic art. So it's not a science because the principles are empirical, the laws carry no necessity, but nonetheless, there's something about systematicity, of being systematic, that suggests really a broader notion of systematicity that probably than the one that we find in the appendix to the Transcendental Dialectic, which is linked to the hypothetical use of reason in providing a touchstone of truth for the cognition of the understanding. And I want to return to this point at the end in one of my remarks. And then the third question is, why does systematicity matters for the history of science and philosophy of science? So I think it's fair to say that Kant's philosophical analysis of systematicity really represents mood music for widespread trends in the sciences of his time. Kant was not just offering a justification for the hugely influential Newtonian mechanics at the time, as Michael Friedman long argued for. He was also responding to the role that systematicity was increasingly playing in the burgeoning chemistry during the chemical revolution at the end of the 18th century, with the classification of different kinds of gases, inflammable air, dephlogisticated air, was echo we find in some of his very, very late writings in the Opus Posthumum. And the increasing systematization of botanical taxa in the life sciences, which we can also see reflected in the third critique, where Kant returns to systematicity, this time within the discussion of the faculty of reflective judgment and the ability to subsume particulars on the universals in a species-genus relation that is no longer a distanciation of Aristotelian logic, but is the expression of wider philosophical trends of the Enlightenment times, trends that the historian Lovejoy I think nicely captured in the book 1936, The Great Chain of Being. So I'm coming to my final two remarks here. My first remark is historical here about really the historical philosophical legacy and profound influence that Kant's idea of systematicity has had on the history of science and history of philosophy. I think there is no doubt that Kant's notion of systematicity had a profound influence in shaping the history of scientific thought. And by this I really mean historiographic trends, the way in which the history of Western science has been narrated from Newton to our century, as well as on the epistemology of science. The idea of science as a systematic inquiry, I think, has led the generations of historians and philosophers to see scientific progress as an increasing process of systematization, where the former, now discarded scientific theories can be seen as limiting cases of better, more recent scientific theories, as in the passage from Newtonian mechanics to Einstein relativity theory, or in the passage from classical physics to quantum mechanics. The Vienna Circle Manifesto for a Unified Science and the International Encyclopedia of Unified Science, that was originally meant to have 26 volumes in Otto Neurath plan, led to a publishing project that ran between 1939 and 1969 and was never completed. But I think it's really testament to the far-reaching legacy of Kant's idea of systematicity for 20th century philosophy of science. And relatedly, the way philosophers of science have long addressed a range of topics, from scientific progress to scientific realism, from the metaphysics of natural kinds to laws of nature, for a large part of the second half of last century, has been sensitive to this quest for systematicity that I think is a legacy of Kant's project. So I come to my final second remark, and this is a remark about what next, what happens next, where to go from here, and what's the future legacy of this notion of systematicity. Can systematicity, no doubt a hugely influential idea, retain its central role in contemporary epistemology of science, philosophy of science? I want to end this discussion with some reasons for skepticism, and also maybe be a little bit provocative just so that we can have a proper panel discussion. So those reasons for skepticism are in part grounded in, I think, contemporary trends in the sciences themselves, and indeed in some of the very scientific disciplines that most inspire Kant's view of systematicity, such as physics. I think it's fair to say that contemporary physics is undergoing a period of crisis where there is increasing evidence that even the best model in particle physics, in cosmology, may need to be revised. But despite searches for new models and new theories, we don't have any novel theories of everything. And it's fair to say that the scientific community at large seems to have gone in a very different methodological direction, one where empirical phenomenological studies of possible new particles is increasingly replacing any search for a theory of everything or a unified theory. So I think contemporary physics in the era of big data and AI-assisted discovery looks a lot more fragmented, a lot more localized and empirically oriented than systematic. The other reason for skepticism I have has to do with calls for decolonizing science and the history of scientific thought. And here I'm just going to make a remark that related to some of my more recent work to date. So in recent years, I haven't so much been working on Kant, but really on questions about realism and pluralism in science. And once you start working on that topic, one thing that comes to mind is really the role of variety of ways of knowing and what sometimes goes under the name local knowledge in scientific knowledge production. So this is a sort of knowledge produced by local communities that are often forgotten and erased in scientific narratives. And so I talk about these communities in my 2022 book on Perspectiva Realism, where I defend a broadly Kantian view of realism as realism about phenomena. But I also warn against the historical injustice of cutting off, severing contribution of historically, culturally situated communities from scientific knowledge production. And the first thing that really jumps to the eyes when trying to understand what's at stake in local knowledge is the fact that it has been historically marginalized as unsystematic. So I'm going to actually pick up, and this is totally unprestablished harmony because I didn't exchange any text with Paul, but I think I agree with Paul's comment that we should avoid pitting science with common knowledge, or what I would call local knowledge. Sometimes local knowledge is presented as not even systematic art, but some kind of mechanic art of the vulgar. And this is something I've been documenting in a forthcoming paper with Abbe Brown and Marcel Jasper in relation to local knowledge of Hebridean crofters. It's coming out in a volume in January 2026 entitled Ways of World Knowing with Oxford University Press. So circling back on Kant and concluding, the worry I have is systematicity might have been a very important tool in the toolbox that for many centuries firmly established certain ways of knowing, namely that of Western science and a particular model of Western science as a kind of hegemonic knowledge, and demarcated that knowledge from other ways of knowing that are less systematic, those of local communities or also indigenous people from the colonies. And therefore, I see systematicity really as a powerful philosophical idea that needs to be treated with caution and reassessed in its wider historical and philosophical context to understand both its merit and its pitfalls when it comes to Western science and the history of Western scientific thoughts. And so on that note, I just want to thank you very much, Thomas Sturm and Achim Vesper and Gabriele Gava for editing what I thought was a fascinating volume of contributions. And thank you all for this symposium.
Yes, thank you very much for that. I'll open it up now to the Q&A. If you just want to raise your hand or even write in the chat, I'll call on you. Gabriele, and I think that's fitting to invite one of the editors to speak since you were explicitly addressed by both of our presenters. So go ahead, Gabriele.
Thanks. Thanks for the comments. So really great question and also criticism. So I just wanted to say something first related to Paul. I think maybe then, and I then leave space sort of also for my colleagues, and I mean both the other editors and the people participating in the book, maybe to add something else. But so I think I have an answer to the first point Paul made, and so I wanted to start with that. So that relates to the difficulty in distinguishing between everyday knowledge and scientific knowledge, right? If you lack a comparative notion of systematicity, but and of course I'm answering starting from my reading of Kantian systematicity, and so I don't that not necessarily represent the view that you find in other contribution in the book. But I think for Kant, there is a way to answering this question that still insists on a type distinction. And I think Kant can achieve that by distinguishing different types of systematicies. And you have, of course, the systematicity of reason that, for example, it's discussed in the appendix, right? So the idea that ideas and also the continuous attempt to increase inferential relationship between our cognition, that's a way to get them more systematic. And there you have a clear notion of less and more. And that's, I think, is where you find a continuity between everyday knowledge and scientific knowledge. But I think what is distinctive about scientific knowledge for Kant is the notion of an idea of the science, right? So basically, so the systematicity of a science is obtained by grasping its idea, and of course, it's difficult to say what that means, but one way is to say, well, we need to have an understanding of what is fundamental for that science so that we see that different cognition belong to that whole. And that's something that is specific about scientific knowledge. And so you have a type distinction between scientific knowledge and everyday knowledge, while still not, I mean, giving up the idea that everyday knowledge is systematic to a certain extent and can be. So there's also the more and less, if you just consider the inferential relationship that you have in science, of course, and also in everyday knowledge. So, well, this is just for the first question, and yeah, thanks.
Okay, I guess, Michela, did you want to say anything in response, or should we just move on to the next question?
Well, I could ask lots of questions to Gabriele, but I'm conscious of the time and
Okay.
the other people. So, I mean, just think very briefly, I'd love to hear more from Gabriele, how he sees the systematicity as an idea of reason to be amenable to coming in degrees to clarify the more or less systematic. I think it's a very interesting idea, but yeah, it's something that we can pick up in conversation maybe by email, so I don't want to take up too much time, but thank you.
Okay. Okay, sure. Okay, the next question will be from one of the contributors actually to the book. So Paul Guyer wrote a chapter, Kant's System of Systems. Go ahead, Paul.
Well, my question, I guess, is aimed at my nominal counterpart, the other Paul. And I'm a little curious about how deep the distinction between systematicity as derived from systematic versus systematicity as derived from system actually goes. So two points on that issue. First, I would have thought perhaps that in ordinary usage of a term like systematic, it's used to characterize sort of qualities of what would be a system, or what could be a system, or could become part of a system. So yes, system is aspirational. Systematic is sometimes used even, well, sometimes provisionally it's sort of system, but systematic is what you need to work towards a system. So I'm not sure how deep the distinction is. Now, in ordinary usage, certainly systematic often might just mean thorough, orderly, doing things in some logical way, like ticking off boxes. First you check for this. If that doesn't work, you check for that. So there are certainly might be ordinary usages of systematic that sort of don't point to the achievement of a system, but many times it would. That's one thing. But the second thing is that, yeah, I could see a difference in Kant between a full-fledged idea of a system and more ordinary ideas of systematicity, because for Kant, as he points out in the second critique, there is only one reason, and reason has theoretical use and practical use, but theoretical reason and practical reason are not two different things. There's only one reason. So if then the one of the goals of reason is to produce a system, ultimately there has to be one system because there's only one reason. And then we get the kind of argument that I was making and that several others point to, that, system of science or the system of the sciences has to somehow fit together with the system of morality and the system of human ends, and Kant is working towards that in the third critique. And that would certainly be something that is might be included in the notion of system, but is probably not included in the sort of everyday notion of being systematic or something like that.
Paul, did you want to respond to Paul?
Yes, I fully agree. You're absolutely right that in everyday usage, systematic means something like orderly, and that may or may not lead to a system. Right? This is exactly what I said. So I fully agree. And if you read in the literature, and I found many locations where people, scientists speak about, and yeah, science is special because we are so systematic and so on. There, it's just this orderly ticking off. And in other cases, if you talk to a mathematician, of course, he means, yes, you got to lead to an axiomatic system. So I fully agree. So the systematicity, is a special case of the systematicity. But I think both notions are important for us today if you systematically investigate what science is. And you are right, and also Michela is right that you find the adjective systematic also in Kant. But I mean, he certainly played a much less important role that it plays in my book. And the reason is fairly simple. Well, one is Kant is a great philosopher, and the second one is there are 250 years in between, or 240 years in between, and the sciences have developed so tremendously. So what Kant was discussing and trying to get some order in was a very, very small thing, and they never had experienced, at least not consciously, scientific revolutions and all of that. And we got to deal with an object, namely science as a whole, including humanities, of course, and mathematics, which is much, much larger. And the idea of this Euclidean idea has long gone for many cases or many disciplines. So I don't see any contradiction between you and me, Paul, which
Good.
is due to our names, of course.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thomas.
Yeah, maybe it's best if I start by dwelling a little bit more on Paul's and Jean de Laurent d'Alembert's distinction between esprit systématique and esprit du système. I think that's a very good distinction to use. And I want to encourage someone here in the room, be it Paul or be it maybe a junior scholar, to write a paper that compares Kant and d'Alembert. As I said, the book was on his shelves, Abhandlung über den Ursprung der Wissenschaften und Künste, which was the preliminary discourse to the encyclopedia. And it has indeed that distinction. And the polemical use in which the polemical context is that d'Alembert finds certain systems of philosophy to be accepted dogmatically or to be asserted dogmatically, and he doesn't like that. And what he wants to emphasize is that the sciences, the new sciences, and he focuses in that important passages, particularly on the experimental sciences, if I remember that correctly. They have a systematic spirit without having a system in the background. So an experimenter can progress in science systematically without having yet a finished idea of what the results will be. And that is what d'Alembert says we should pursue. And that's a good point. I agree about that, and Kant is not very strongly emphasizing that, but he has a different, and I would say at least as important, if not more important, distinction that is related to this distinction between the adjective and the noun, namely the following. Kant not only thinks about science as a finished product, but always thinks about the progress and the process of scientific research. You can see that already in the famous B preface of the Critique of Pure Reason, when he speaks about how certain sciences can reach the secure path of a science. The secure path of science, how the co-workers ought to collaborate to bring a certain field on the secure path. And then he speaks really historically about that. He speaks about how logic was invented by Aristotle and actually was almost finished by Aristotle. He makes certain historical claims there that are a little bit overblown, to say the least. Then he speaks about how geometry was invented by Euclid or Thales, or it doesn't actually matter. And he says in a footnote that the historicity, the historical accuracy of his claims do not really matter. What he wants to make is a more principled point, namely that the sciences develop over time and make progress. And that depends, of course, on how much reason there is invested in them. And that is the systematic processes that scientists use, whether they have a finished system in their head already or not. They must be guided by certain ideas and concepts and principles of reason or of the understanding. That depends on which context, which text actually we are dealing with in Kant's oeuvre. I think that's a very, very important distinction to be made. Most scholarship on Kant's notion of systematicity concerns, for instance, how does he conceive of scientific laws and their relation to reality? Yeah? Is the system of scientific laws an indicator or a guarantee for that nature itself is systematic? How is the relation between our representation of natural laws and the actual relations between objects out there? And that is a question, I think, about science considered as a finished product, as a doctrine that is related to reality somehow, but not about the actual process of bringing about scientific knowledge, and particularly not about making progress or discovering new theories and discovering new truths in science. And Kant is actually also thinking about that, and that is the most important. So whatever we think about the ordinary terms, whether it's primarily an adjective or a noun that we have to consider, the important thing is that we do not conceive of science only as a final product, but also as a process and a product and a progressive process in particular, and what the contribution of philosophy can be there. And I think this is also something that I myself learned by producing this book only. I didn't have that clear in my mind, that with regard to Kant, we do not only have to distinguish between the logical notion of systematicity and the real notion of systematicity, but also between this process and the product notions of systematicity. We have to keep both in mind whenever he's talking about something being systematic, something being scientific. We need to think for our reconstruction of the text, for our understanding, interpretation of the text, which of these four aspects, so to speak, of systematicity he has on his mind. And that would be something to connect more to other areas of Paul's work. I mean here Paul Hoyningen-Huene. So philosophy of science in the 20th century was dominated or started to some extent from the notorious discovery justification distinction. Yeah? Philosophers of science only look at the justification of finished products of scientific theories and disregard how scientific knowledge is generated or how it is discovered or how it is produced. And I think Kant, although he has similar distinctions like that going on in his work, he always has in mind that it is also a task for philosophy, if we want to understand science as a rational product, to think about the process-related side of scientific knowledge. And that is also important for his understanding of systematicity. That's what I want to say about D'Alembert and Kant. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. So I think we have time for just one more question or comment. And I see Gabriele, your hand is up. I don't see anyone else. So go ahead, Gabriele.
Yeah, of course, if anybody else has a question or so, I would love also to hear others say something. So really, just if that's not the case.
I don't see anyone else. So
Okay, good. No, I just wanted to say a couple of things. So one, so maybe I say this first that relates to a point Michela made. So I think was part of her second question and related to, so why is the systematicity of science important to understand what systematicity is for Kant? Because, for instance, he regarded disciplines that he does not consider sciences as being also systematic, right? And so so there is a question there. I mean, I think that there is a difficulty there, which is more challenging than distinguishing between um, scientific knowledge and everyday knowledge, as I tried to do in my first answer. So because it seems you could say, well, regarding chemistry, you could have an idea of the science, right? Like a description of what that discipline does that help you to, figure out what is part of that and not of another science, for instance. And I think that's an issue. But maybe what Kant had in mind there was that. So one part of his insistence that there should be an a priori part in the sciences was the idea that it is only through that a priori part that you can make the boundaries of the science clear and and stable in a way, right? So that systematic discipline that lack that a priori part, for instance, well, would lack that. So but that's not really a final answer. So just a suggestion for now. But yeah, and then I wanted. Well, I have also some doubt as the other Paul had on the systematicity distinction, because I mean, at least as I can see, so Paul Hoyningen-Huene would also say that everything that we can call systematic as a system as a name, at least, or something like that. So that's maybe more a question. So, and if that's true, then so I would say we cannot really have the systematic without some relation to the system. So yeah, so I wanted to ask. I mean, this is related to for example, the role completeness play in your account, right? So it seems in order to have completeness, you need to have the notion of a whole in a certain sense related to a system. So maybe, yeah, if you can say something on that. Thanks.
May I?
Yes, please.
Yeah, no, I disagree. I mean, in my book, I do have as one of these 9 dimensions, I have this notion of completeness. I also had that already in my 79 stuff. So if I look at systematicity as it's used in the sciences, or as it's playing a role in the sciences, of course, an idea of completeness is there. But if you look now at this notion of completeness in the historical sciences, I mean, there, completeness is relativized because there is no complete description of a historical process. Everyone knows that. But you may say, well, that a certain historical book, is seriously incomplete. So if you write about, well, Nazi stuff, and then Goebbels doesn't play a role, you may say this book is seriously incomplete, although you can never reach the full story in which you tell every single detail, because then you're going to tell 60 million biographies or something. So that's impossible. So, and there you see that notions of completeness may play a role without being tied to the system completeness, right? The system completeness is good for mathematics. It works there. Or it may work in physics to some degree, that you have a complete number of the interactions, or you have a complete classification in biology. But as soon as you look for, well, even the sort of completeness, say, in the life cycles theories in psychology, there are 10 different life cycle theories. Well, it's the cycle has to be complete, from birth to death, but it's not really a system that you can't say. So as soon as you've got this temporary and this ticking off, as the other Paul said, which is a very good point of, being orderly by ticking off a list, but that's not a system. So, and there, of course, I've completely ticked off the items of my list. That's not a system. So I don't agree. I think this adjective derivated notion of systematicity stands on its own feet. Although, of course, linguistically, it's derived from system as well. But the meaning it has today, it's much more this just orderly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So, although we can keep talking and catching up with each other if we wish, I suggest we bring the official part of this book symposium to a close. And I just want to conclude by congratulating the editors and the authors on the publication of Kant and the Systematicity of the Sciences.